Hallownest in Hollow Knight is filled with loads of different areas, and each of those areas have loads of different enemies, ranging in difficulty. Some are a lot harder to defeat than others, so in this video I'm going to be choosing each place in Hallownest's hardest enemy, starting with Dirtmouth. Yeah, there's no enemies here, so let's move on to Forgotten Crossroads. Originally, I thought of ranking Aspid Mother as the hardest enemy, simply because of how overwhelming it is with all of the Aspid babies. But then I remembered that the Husk Guard exists. This guy is ridiculously tanky and pretty hard to kill. Obviously you can just skip past him, but I remember struggling a lot with this guy on my first playthrough, so I'm saying he is the hardest enemy in the whole of Crossroads. However, if you get the Monarch Wings, or kill one of the Dreamers, the Crossroads changes a lot. The Crossroads becomes the Infected Crossroads. And along with this change, it also changes all the enemies. The enemies before that were easy pushovers are now suicide bombers that come running at you and explode as soon as they touch you. Whereas these guys are pretty tricky to avoid, they're not the hardest enemy in the whole of the Infected Crossroads. The hardest enemy in the Infected Crossroads is the Furious Vengefly. This is because it has such a big hitbox and is really hard to avoid. It also has a lot of health. Moving on from the Crossroads, let's go to Green Path. Originally, I was thinking about putting Squits as the hardest enemy, but these guys are a lot more annoying than they are difficult to defeat. I then thought of the Gulkers, but you can just run past these, so they're no big of a threat. But then I remembered the Moss Knight. These guys aren't too hard to kill, but when I was first there, they were, and I struggled a lot on them. Though I eventually killed them, though there are two in this one room, so that makes them a lot harder. Anyways, these guys are the hardest enemy in Green Path. Next up is the Fog Canyon, which was an incredibly easy choice. The Umas. This is because they have the orange core, which, once you attack them once, will chase after you and do 2 explosion damage. This is really hard to avoid and is by far the hardest enemy in the whole Fog Canyon. Originally, I thought the hardest enemy in Fungal Wastes was the Sporg, as they shoot bullets that are really hard to avoid and again do 2 hearts of damage from the explosion. But then I also thought of the Shroomal Warriors, because when I was first in Fungal Wastes, killing them was like hell. Though the hardest is definitely the Shroomal Ogre. It's literally a whole mini boss, it has loads of health, and there is also 2 of them in the arena. They also spit acid puddles, which are really hard to avoid. So the Shroomal Ogres are definitely the hardest enemies in the whole of Fungal Wastes. Next up is the Mantis Village. Choosing this was really easy, because there are only 2 enemies in the whole Mantis Village. Though the Mantis Warriors are harder to dodge than the Mantis Youths, and they have more health, so it's a very clear choice for which one's the hardest in the Mantis Village. Right after the Mantis Village is Deep Nest. In Deep Nest, I originally thought of the hardest enemy being the Little Weaver, the little spiders that come out of nowhere and start attacking you. This is because they're really annoying to kill. They also spawn from mid-air, which makes them hard to dodge. However, by far, the hardest enemy in Deep Nest is the Stalking Devout, because you can't just dash through it. You can only attack it when it opens its mask to attack you, so using Vengeful Spirit is the best way to kill them, but you need to get the soul from attacking them anyway. This makes them the hardest enemy in Deep Nest. The next place is the City of Tears. There are quite a few hard enemies in this area, but none of them particularly stand out as harder than the others. So I'm going to go with the Great Husk Sentry. This is because it's hard to land attacks on, and he attacked you quite a bit, so he's pretty tricky to kill. Though this isn't the end of the City of Tears, because this guy may be the hardest enemy in City of Tears. However, if you go further into City of Tears, there's the Soul Sanctum. This was the easiest choice by far. The Soul Twisters are definitely the most difficult, most annoying enemies in the whole game, and I swear these guys are harder than the Soul Master himself. Okay, but seriously, these guys are definitely the hardest enemies in Soul Sanctum. Next up is the Queen's Gardens. There isn't many enemies in this place, as most of it is platforming, but there are a few, including the Spiny Husk, which is super annoying to dodge and kill, but is not the hardest. The hardest enemy in the Queen's Gardens is the Mantis Petra, because these guys are super annoying. They have quite a bit of health, and I always take damage whenever I fight them. Next up is the Resting Grounds, and you're probably thinking, what are you on about? There isn't any enemies in Resting Grounds. However, if you Desolate Dive into this crate, the Entombed Husk is the only enemy, therefore making him the hardest enemy in the Resting Grounds. Straight on to the next one, Crystal Peak. I would have said the Crystal Hunter as the hardest enemy, as they shoot projectiles that explode into loads of spikes on the floor that do damage. However, you can not only deflect the bullets they shoot at you, but you can also destroy crystals they place by attacking them, making them so much easier to kill. So instead, I think the hardest enemy is the Crystal Crawler, as they shoot massive lasers which are impossible to avoid, and you can't kill them with your nail. I hate these guys so much, and always take damage to them. Now let's go to Royal Waterways. First, I fought the Flukemon, as they split into two when killed, and well, they make this sound. But obviously they're not the hardest. The hardest is the Flukemonger, as they block the hallways that go to Godhome, and are so annoying to kill. Next up is Kingdom's Edge. I thought of the Bellfly first, because, well, they do 2 damage, and I originally thought that you had to just tank it. But turns out you can actually just upslash them. It makes them so much easier to kill. And then I thought of the Great Hoppers, as they're super annoying to kill. And then, of course, I remembered Primal Aspids were in this kingdom. Yeah. And further up in Kingdom's Edge is Colosseum of Fools. I would have said the Spell Twister, but then I have already said that in Soul Sanctum, so I'm going to say the hardest enemy is the Vault Twister. This is just because they're so hard to kill, and it's basically just the Umu boss fight, but there's several of them. So yeah, these are the hardest enemies in the Colosseum of Fools. And then further down in Kingdom's Edge is the Hive, and first I thought of the Hive Soldier, as it does the stupid charge attack, though it is nothing compared to the Hive Guardian, because it does 2 massive damage, has a massive, and I mean massive, hitbox, and it also breaks platforms that you would use to parkour on, especially to the Hive Knight. Though, of course, this boss fight is made so much easier with the Dream Gate, but the Hive Guardian is by far the hardest enemy in the whole game. And then to the left of the Hive is the Ancient Basin. In the Ancient Basin, the Morlurk is by far the hardest enemy. Not just because its attacks are hard to avoid, and it's hard to get attacks on them, but they give me flashbacks to this guy, who I killed way earlier in my playthrough than I should have. Next up is Howling Cliffs / King's Pass. The hardest enemy is the Elder Boulder here, because it's the only challenging enemy in this area. Then right at the bottom of the map is the Abyss. The hardest enemy in the Abyss is probably the siblings. They do 2 damage and are stupid to kill, and they infinitely spawn on your way up to the lighthouse. Last, but probably the least, is White Palace. This is because there's hardly any enemies here. I would say the Wings Mold, but these guys are literally unkillable, so I'm not going to count them. So I'm going to say the King's Mold instead, which is a pretty tricky mini-boss. So that's the hardest enemy in White Palace. And also the end of the video. If you guys did enjoy this video, please subscribe, as it took me a lot of effort. Also, this is the first video on my channel, so I'd really appreciate it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.